Welcome to episode 6 of Ethereal Threads with Eugene Tassani. And I would like to focus this episode on topography and geography. In specific, we're going to be looking at the World Atlas. So if you guys have a globe at home, and I might be dating myself a little bit talking about globes. I don't know if anybody purchases those anymore, but either a globe or if you can pull up a World Atlas on the internet, and then zoom in so that it's large enough to see the shapes of different countries and continents. And that's where we will start. So my disclaimer for this episode is that when I can see something with spiritual eyes or with a spiritual filter, I have to remind myself that what I am being shown isn't necessarily representative of ethnicities, nationalities, cultures, or religions. And I say that because in Scripture, God talks about how He puts signs in the heavens and the skies and in the earth for His people to observe certain festivities and Shabbat, and to understand how prophecy relates to their timeline, whether it's a fictitious man-made timeline or if they're following a biblical timeline. So, considering that disclaimer, we are going to look at the shapes of continents and countries and how those shapes relate to scriptural prophecy. Now, to start, I'm going to call out a few chapters and verses that deal with this theme of God leaving signs in the earth and in the skies. And we'll start with Genesis chapter 1, verse 14, and then Luke chapter 21, verse 25, and then in Joel chapter 2, and in Revelation chapter 12, in the book of Psalms, Psalm 19, verses 1 to 2. And then signs in the land, you've got Exodus chapter 4, verse 8, Deuteronomy chapter 11, verse 3, the book of Isaiah chapter 7, the book of Matthew chapter 24, and the book of Acts chapter 2. So those are all scriptural foundations for looking to the land with a spiritual lens to understand what it is that God's communicating to us. The most important piece to reviewing this World Atlas is understanding the tribe of Dan and Dan's significance in biblical prophecy. So in the book of Genesis, in the NIV Bible version, we read that Dan will provide justice for his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan will be a snake by the roadside, a viper along the path that bites the horse's heels so that its rider stumbles backward. That is the prophecy in the book of Genesis for the tribe of Dan. So Dan, as a symbol, represents a serpent, cunning, dangerous, possibly double-edged. He represents biting the horse's heel, which could be undermining power or causing a fall. He represents, or within his prophecy, illustrates a rider, unspecified. This could represent enemies or maybe internal leadership. And then there's also a biblical echo similar to the serpent biting the heel in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. But in that particular verse, Dan is actually referred to as the serpent. And in Genesis, we are provided with a prophecy that says that God will put enmity between the serpent and the woman, and between the serpent's offspring and the woman's offspring, and that the woman's offspring will crush Satan's head, and Satan will strike the Messiah's heel. This is in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. So keep those in mind as we kind of search out the tribe of Dan's representation in the global atlas. So to start, just kind of look at the entire globe, and I'm going to call out the continents and the countries one by one. And if you can see the spiritual imprint in the land, good. If not, don't force it. I would say if you're a praying person, then petition for God to reveal these truths. Or just don't force it at all. If you're not interested in how biblical prophecy is shown in the signs of the sky and the earth and in the waters, then that is your prerogative. And I'm not going to force what it is that I'm seeing onto anybody else. Okay, so look at the continent of Africa and picture that the continent of Africa is actually a facial silhouette. Okay? Not necessarily a human silhouette, but some type of creation that has an enlarged skull towards the back of the silhouette. And then towards the eastern shore, there you can see the Horn of Africa, which is represented as a landmass that looks like an actual horn. And then between the Congo and Tanzania, there's almost like an imprint of an eye. And that eye would be, looks like Uganda. So if you view the continent of Africa as a facial silhouette, the eye of Uganda is looking east towards a landmass that is near what would presumably be the nose, and that is the land of Madagascar. Now, Madagascar, at first glance, looks like a baby swaddled in cloth. A baby swaddled in cloth, as we have seen in the Old Testament when Moses was put into a basket and sent down the river. He was swaddled in cloth. And there are other instances in the Old and New Testament of newborns who are swaddled in cloth as a means to preserve body heat and if they have to travel for safety and protection. So the silhouette of Africa with a horn is glaring at the shape of a swaddled infant. Okay, stay with me. Now look above Libya, where there is almost like a divot in the top of the skull of this facial silhouette. And above that divot, and potentially causing that divot or that crushing of that segment of the skull, is the boot of Italy, a high heel boot of Italy. Okay? Now, in Scripture, in the book of Genesis, Scripture says, I will put enmity between the devil and the woman, and between the devil's offspring and the woman's offspring. And the woman's offspring will crush the devil's head, and the devil will strike the Messiah's heel. So keep that in mind. If Africa represents Satan's head, then we're seeing a boot crush the top of the skull. And then I want you to look at Saudi Arabia, the peninsula of Saudi Arabia. And notice that the shape of Saudi Arabia looks like a boot, like a larger, maybe steel-toed boot. And then keep in mind the prophecy about the heel that the tribe of Dan is supposed to strike. In Genesis 49, verses 6 to 17, in the NIV version, Scripture states, Dan will provide justice for his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan will be a snake by the roadside, a viper along the path that bites the horse's heels so that its rider tumbles backward. Now, for those of you who are involved in equestrian sports, or if you've ever been horseback riding, the heel could be represented in the peninsula of Saudi Arabia. If you think about when a boot goes into the stirrup and a rider intends to mount the horse, they put their boot into the stirrup and then kind of lift themselves up and put them into the saddle. The boot, because of the stirrup and the stirrup positions, almost distorts the shape of the boot and makes it look maybe a little smaller than what it actually is. And that's kind of what the silhouette of Saudi Arabia looks like. It looks like a boot sitting in a stirrup. And that's significant because if the tribe of Dan is represented with the African continent, then we can see where Italy's boot crushes Satan's head, and Satan lifts his head and strikes up at Saudi Arabia, thus fulfilling the prophecy that Dan would bite the horse's heel so that its rider tumbles backward. So this could be a few different implications. One of them being that Dan strikes from a low, unexpected position, targeting the foundation of power to unseat the rider, and then the rider tumbles backward, like a sudden reversal, or possibly signifying some type of judgment or sabotage or a disruption of leadership. Either way, within this segment, like the middle of this Earth Atlas, there's a lot of hostility and prophecy that is potentially being represented in this section of the map. And to pull it all together, what I'm seeing from a spiritual perspective is that the Messiah crushes Satan's head from above. The tribe of Dan, potentially represented in the silhouette of the continent of Africa, represents all forms of man-made law. So man-made law would in and of itself be contrary to God's law. And keep in mind that man-made law includes the Talmud, Sharia law, martial law. Any type of man-made system seems to come from the tribe of Dan and their version of justice, whether right or wrong. And it's interesting because Sharia law was introduced into Saudi Arabia in the 7th century and was introduced and eventually manifested into a form of punishment to silence women. And for those who have listened to previous episodes, the adversary absolutely hates women and children because of what women and children represent in the messianic lineage. And then, of course, at the top of the African continent above Libya, we see where the woman's heel crushes Satan's head. And that heel is indicative of Italy. Now, I'm not talking about the Roman Catholic Church. Like I said, I do not apply religions, ethnicities, or nationalities or cultures to anything that I am seeing in this geography, because I think what I'm seeing predates all of those establishments. And now we are going to shift our attention to the western portion of the atlas. And if you look at North America, the shape from the tip of, what is that up there? Touching Greenland. It's like the territories that are touching Greenland near the Arctic Ocean to the western coast of Alaska would represent wings. And then Quebec, which shows two kind of nodules that are coming up into points out of Quebec, represents the head. And then if you follow the coastline along the east coast to Mexico and Central America, that's the tail. And then following from Central America around Mexico back up towards California and then up towards Alaska completes the silhouette of what looks like a dragon. And that dragon appears to be clutching South America. And South America is also in the shape of a boot. And it looks like the dragon is potentially dragging South America towards the continent of Africa, almost as though trying to fit a puzzle piece into the African continent. So where the South American continent potentially separated itself from Africa, it looks like the dragon is trying to reunite South America with Africa. And then shifting to the opposite side of the atlas, I'd like to look at Australia. Australia has a silhouette of a dolphin. And if you need to refresh like what a dolphin looks like, go online, look up a dolphin, try and find something with a silhouette, maybe a dolphin like jumping up out of the water because the body has a curvature to it. And at first, when I looked at the shape of the dolphin, I wasn't sure what the prophetic symbolism was or if there was any. And then when I researched, I realized that a dolphin spiritually represents new birth and or new life, which is a prophetic fulfillment of the new earth and new Jerusalem. And that is the spiritual information that I can impart in this episode. If you guys are still following these podcasts, then first and foremost, thank you. And I would also like to provide a little bit more information if you guys are looking for spiritual nourishment. Although this podcast series is centered on the Bio-Kovo Code and some of the themes within the book series, there's a lot of prophetic insight that I have been taught for more than a decade. And I have been compiling and researching and really just being patient, allowing myself some liberty to take time to digest the information that I've been taught. And so I've put a lot of that information into a free online course on the Teachable platform. And if I can point you guys to that website, if you're looking for more spiritual nourishment, I encourage you to go and visit this website to maybe learn some different perspectives that haven't been taught in the churches. And that website is fedandquenched.teachable.com/L/products. And I'll spell out that first section of the URL. fed, and then a hyphen, the word and, A-N-D, hyphen, quenched, Quenched, teachable, teachable.com/L/products. And I'll read that URL, fedandquenched.teachable.com/L/products. Thank you so much.